Hi guys, Matt Easton here. So I'm here with Paul Mortimer again, looking at some other non-Sutton Hoo recreations of artefacts. So we've got here two swords that are both of 7th century?
Late 6th, early 7th.
Late 6th, early 7th century. Both from Anglo-Saxon, or based on Anglo-Saxon finds. So what's this one?
This is from Buckland over in Kent. I think it's grave 93. I can't remember. It's
Okay, we'll show you these a little bit closer at the moment, in a minute. And this one is...
That's the blade is from Pritterwell in Southend, Essex.
Okay.
It's not the famous Pritterwell grave, the Pritterwell print. It's from a cemetery which was discovered at the turn of the 20th century when they put the railway in.
And this, you said...
The pommel is actually from one of the metal ones from the Staffordshire Hoard.
Okay, so we've got a combination of finds to create a plausible sword of that period from original pieces, and they've both got pattern-welded blades. What kind of proportion of swords at this period had pattern-welded blades?
Well, I think probably all of them.
Yeah?
Certainly in the 7th century, when they looked at them, Barry Ager and Janet Lang found 100% of 7th century swords to be pattern-welded.
Wow.
But actually, in my survey of swords, and I've looked at about 300, almost all of them are pattern-welded.
Right, okay. And again, so comparing with the Sutton Hoo sword, we've got a similar arrangement to later Dark Age swords, in that you've essentially got an eye-shaped hilt. Both the upper and lower guards are, well, in this case they're made of a mixture of organic and metal elements. In this case, pretty much the entire hilt's organic, except for the pommel cap. But we'll bring them closer in a second. What's the difference in the pattern welding? Should we actually? Should we go close to the camera? So there's. Let's see if I. There we go. There's.
This has 3 rods in the middle, but it's got a more elaborate pattern than the Sutton Hoo. And once again, if you turn it over, it's 2 layered, so the pattern's offset on the rear. It's made by Vince Evans, as was the Sutton Hoo, but it's a very pretty and fine looking blade. But it's a very different feel of blade to the Sutton Hoo blade. It's much thinner and longer.
And so the pattern is, we've got obviously various bars twisted, rods twisted in the centre here, but also the edge sections, which are forge welded on, seem to have a sort of lines in them. What are these lines that are sort of...
That's just where the metal of the edge has been folded many times.
Okay.
So it in effect creates laminations.
Okay, right. And okay, so there's plenty of videos that you guys can watch explaining how pattern welding is done. You can see it in action. But this is the results of Vince Evans' work. And Vince Evans, of course, is one of the most famous high-end sword makers, especially in pattern welding.
He's pretty good, yeah.
Yeah, very, very good. And let's just look at the hilt of this one. So what we've got here is, I'll hold it against a light background so it's a bit easier to see. There we go. So we've got a dark horn grip. Oh, and incidentally, both these swords belong to Steve Pollington. So thanks, Steve, if you're watching this, for lending the swords. Very useful. Nice comparison as well, because these are both feel very different, and they are very different swords to the Sutton Hoo sword. So whilst there are basic similar features, they are quite, there's quite a lot of variation between these swords. So we've got a metal, in fact there's 4 elements in this, I think, isn't there? Yeah. So this metal cap at the top, based on the Staffordshire Hoard. There we go.
Once again, it's got a different face on the other side.
So we've got a little Where's Waldo face on one side, and then on the other side we've got some beasts.
Yeah. Ravening beasts.
So this guy, it's interesting, he's got little dots on his face and on his chin like stubble, and on this side 2 beasts. And so this cap at the top, usually known as a pommel cap, is 1 piece. Then we've got essentially a flat element. Then we've got another flat element which is black horn that matches the grip in this case, and then we've got another flat metal element, and there, first of all, the pommel cap is riveted to this top plate, and then all of the plates are riveted through, right the way through here, and there's, you can see the top and bottom of the domed rivet heads at either end. And then the guard, the main guard, has got similar construction, metal plate, horn, metal plate, and then the whole thing riveted at either side. It's interesting to me, I've never really understood why they went to so much effort to make so many elements into the, when they could have made this as one piece and this as one piece.
Well, sometimes they do, but they do seem to like the complexity of things.
Yeah.
And the difficulty of making them. They seem to celebrate that.
And as I mentioned in the Sutton Hoo video, just try not to stab the ceiling here, there are, when you look in pictures in books or look in museums and you see these rivet heads here and here, you think, well, isn't that going to hurt the hand? But bizarrely, it just doesn't seem to, really.
No.
Doesn't seem to, maybe it rubs slightly against the index finger, but the way that I would hold the sword, so just move back a bit, actually once you're moving it, because of the weight of the blade and the point of balance being fairly far from the hand, the sword wants to go that way, so actually it's pulling away from that rivet head, and you are going towards that rivet head, but it just doesn't seem to really rub on the hand, doesn't seem to be a problem. This sword I particularly like, it's particularly comfortable in the hand. And the grip is, from my point of view, been very nicely done. It's very flat, which gives a very good edge alignment. That's not going to turn in the hand at all. And having the ribs on the grip, and they're very smooth because it's all horn, having the ribs there prevents the hand from pulling down too hard against that pommel and creating too much friction. It creates, in other words, you've got more points of contact or more friction on the grip, and actually gives a really good grip on the sword. So let's have a look at the other one. Do you want to move into camera?
This is the sword from Dover, Buckland, Kent, and it's had a pretty much all organic hilt, except for the metal pommel, and it's a true pommel in this one. It's not just the cap.
Oh, and it's actually peened at the end there, right?
Yeah.
So I should mention, most of these period swords, the tang comes up here and is actually peened underneath.
Yeah, there's a true pommel underneath the cap.
Yeah.
And in the Sutton Hoo one, it's actually made of gold.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this pommel cap essentially hides where the tang comes from.
And that's why you have these rivets, just to hold that cap on.
And that incidentally is the same on most Viking era swords as well. The end part of the pommel hides where the tang comes through. This is different, however, in that the tang comes all the way through to the end and is peened at the end there.
The blade on this one is, once again, very pleasing. I don't know if you can see. It's by Paul Binns. It's 4 rods, I think. I'll just try and pass that along and show you the pattern.
Very nice. So it's a completely different pattern to the other sword we've just looked at, and has there been any attempt to catalogue patterns?
Funny you should say that.
Ah, right, you're doing it.
Yeah, it's, with the help of Brian Gilmore at the Oxford Archaeological Research Labs, yeah.
I do wonder if, a bit like the hamon on Japanese blades, I wonder if certain patterns were known to be from certain places or certain smiths.
It's too early to say, but I wouldn't be at all surprised.
Yeah, it's very interesting and relatively understudied sort of area of swordsmithing. And so this is mostly made of organic elements. It doesn't have the metal plates incorporated into the upper or lower guard, doesn't have any metal in the grip. It's just got an iron pommel cap that's actually a real pommel in this case. Do you think this is a lower status sword? Not to say low status, but lower.
Yeah, I think it probably is. I suspect that the more elaborate hilts are actually a form of medal or badge of rank, and as you progress, you actually get your sword re-hilted.
So you keep your blade. I mean, in actual fact, the blades of these, you couldn't say one is a more valuable blade than the other. They're both good pattern welded blades.
Once again, they don't have fullers, but the picture weld is very flat actually in the centre of the blade.
Do we know that these didn't have fullers on the originals?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
We're certain of these.
So the fullered blades at this date are the minority?
The evidence so far seems to indicate that that's the case. Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah, but as I said before, it's not impossible. Lots of fullers have gone unrecognised because swords are buried in their scabbards and they haven't all been x-rayed or examined to the extent where they may have found a fuller.
Yeah. Should we just back out so you guys can see more of us? So, in terms of them as swords, the fuller does relate. It does contribute to this blade presence. All of these swords are. The point of balance is quite far out. I mean, if we just balance this on, again, that's about 10 or 11 inches, I should imagine, from the...
Let's try that one.
Yeah, from the hilt, and that's a little bit closer actually. That's probably 9 or 10 inches. But nevertheless, within the context of swords from all over history, that is pretty far from the hand. I mean, if you're talking about between 9 and 12 inches from the hand, that is a point of balance that's very far from the hand. Tulwars tend to be about 7 or 8 inches. The 1796 pattern light cavalry sabre is about 8 inches usually, I think. Most medieval arming swords are usually only about 4 or 5 inches. Long swords are usually 4 or 5 inches. So the point of balance that far up really tells you something about how this type of sword was used, and it is quite distinctive, it's quite different. But, as I say, it's definitely, in my mind, I don't know how you feel about it, but it's definitely related to, it's definitely related to the Viking era, or Frankish, later Anglo-Saxon era type of sword. I mean, if we just look superficially, the hilt is a similar construct, it's an I shape. You do have this angle at the pommel, you have obviously a relatively short guard. The grips, the same kind of length range. Even if we hold the blades up, they're a similar configuration, they're a similar length, they're both quite broad, quite parallel edged. Yes, the later sword has usually, well, pretty much always has a fuller, and yes, these usually are a bit more tapered than the earlier sort of migration era sword, but they're broadly speaking pretty similar, they're very clearly related. And
do you think that would the changes in the later sword would actually make it handle differently?
I think from what I've seen, the point of balance on the later Viking era sword seems to be a bit closer to the hand, but I have to say, talking broadly within the context of swords from across the world, from across history, this is still a very blade heavy sword. So I actually think they're not that different. You don't think they handle it any differently? I don't think they're very different, and even if we look at the construction, I mean, if I just bring this closer, yes, this is an Albion with a non-historical construction, but essentially they're still made with a upper and lower guard and then a pommel cap on the top. Even in the 9th century, even in the 11th century, you're still getting swords made essentially the same way as this from the 6th, 7th century.
So they're basically Roman spathers.
Yeah, so I mean they're very, very clearly still closely related swords. And I think one of the things that's particularly interesting about migration era swords is we've actually got, debatably, more information about the grips of these than we have about the later period swords. Because of the way these were constructed, they often just survive better, actually.
Well, they're buried in graves, but the later swords, most of the finds we have are from rivers. So.
River fans, so the organic material rots and we're left with the metal. And I think that, when we're talking about how these swords are gripped, people often focus on the Viking era swords, where we don't have a lot of information about the grip. Yes, there are some surviving grips on them, but I think it's really important to look at the grips on the earlier migration era swords, because if we're talking about how to grip these swords, the grip of the sword is clearly a very important element in that.
The most common material on Anglo-Saxon hilts is definitely horn, over and above everything else. So.
Yeah, and I think just one particular thing of note, whether it's the Sutton Hoo Sword or whether it's either of these swords, they all have forms of rib on the grip. And very early on in me obtaining a Viking era sword, I actually got some hair ties, or elastic bands essentially, and put them around the grip of the sword, and I found that it's assisting me in the use of the Viking era sword. And there are Viking era and Frankish Anglo-Saxon later period swords that do have ribs on the grip, and I think that's a very important and perhaps to a degree overlooked element of how these swords work. and those ribs I think are quite important. We do incidentally still find ribs halfway up the grip on later period medieval swords as well, and they really assist in leverage on the grip, but also blade grip retention as well. But I think this sword in particular, in some ways, looking at later period swords, this simpler hilted one is almost more interesting from an evolution of swords point of view, because this is actually closer to later period swords, which is very interesting.
Absolutely.
But there we go, guys. Thanks, Paul, again, and hopefully we'll be seeing some more weapons and equipment from this era in future videos. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Click subscribe now and also follow us on Facebook.